Chapter 13, European Society in the Age of the Renaissance. We use the term Renaissance to describe this period in European history that follows the catastrophes of the 14th century, and this so-called Renaissance begins in the 15th century, describing a period of culture and history marked by a return to the study and imitation and admiration of Greek and Roman society. It's a rebirth. The word literally means rebirth of art, of learning, of culture, of science, knowledge, architecture, ways of thinking, philosophy. It's a term that matters to historians, and it's also debated by historians whether or not this thing called the Renaissance was real or and to what degree it affected people. What we do know for sure is that after the age of calamity in the 14th century, there was this resurgence of interest in classical civilization, and it led to incredible changes for at least some of the people in European society, and so it's really worth our study. And this is one of my favorite chapters and topics that we will deal with all year, so let's get right to it. At the bottom of your outline on page 1, I've listed out some definitions of the term Renaissance and where they came from and what they mean. These are not found in your textbook, so I'll talk them through pretty briefly right now, but look at them carefully. It's a period of European history from about 1300 to 1500. I already explained here it means the rebirth of interest in classical antiquity. That phrase, classical antiquity, means Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome. The Italian word for this period is Rinascimento, Renaissance. Cool word, same thing. The beginning of modern European history, according to most historians, marked by a flourishing of artistic and intellectual energy. People believed they were living in a so-called golden age. It starts in the Italian city-states, as we'll find out quickly, and then it spreads to Northern Europe, to England, to Flanders, to the Netherlands. Who realized this and when? Well, several people of importance living at the time decided that they were ready for a change, a break in periodization and the constructing of periods of history. And the first guy to do this was Petrarch, an Italian poet, who was the first person to ever use the term Dark Ages to describe what was had come right before him. We would call medieval Europe or the Middle Ages. He termed it the Dark Ages. And it's not a surprise because of what we studied in chapter 12, how rough that century was for people. The plague, war, famine, the schisms in the church. It was kind of a mess. So he says, I don't belong to that. That's not for me. Gothic churches and medieval architecture and a whole way of thinking. Remember the song I played for you in class, the O Fortuna, that fate and is against us. That's gloomy, and we're not going to live like that anymore. And he traces all of that back to the end of the Roman Empire when these barbarian hordes from the Germanic parts of Europe invaded and destroyed the Roman Empire, and they destroyed learning and reason. This is his theory, his thesis. And now we're going to bring all that back, the best parts of the ancient world in a golden age. The other person who is most influential in coining this term and inventing really the idea historically of the Renaissance is Jacob Burckhardt, a Swiss historian living 500 years down the road in 1860, right around the time of the U.S. Civil War. And he wrote probably the most important book ever on the Renaissance because it was one of the first that categorized this period of history as a unique time that was different from what came before it. And his thesis I summarized for you right here. The atmosphere of insecurity in Italy encouraged the emergence of ruthless individuals, free spirits, and geniuses. And I'll talk to you today about the atmosphere of political insecurity and that was in Italy because there was no Italy. And then for the rest of this unit, we'll be talking about the individuals, the free spirits, and the geniuses that produced some of the greatest art, sculpture, poetry, and science that had ever been seen. Most historians, like Burckhardt, believe that the origins of what we think about the world today, about ourselves as humans, about government, about the role of the individual in society, all of that can be found here in the Renaissance. You will find this very relatable. And because of that, it's so different from the medieval era it's a clear break from the past. Now, this is history, so there's always an argument, and other people are going to come in later centuries and decades and say, no, 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 the Renaissance didn't really even happen. It wasn't really a thing, or if it did, it was only for a few people. And if it did, it was just slow and gradual, and it was not this distinct period in history. So it's a debate historically, but for the purposes of our class, we will accept the idea that there was an Italian Renaissance, and now we're about to learn about the political background of it. So, switching over here to some political specifics, let's take a look at the map of Italy. There is no country of Italy in the 1400s, 1500s, during the Renaissance. There is no nation of Italy. What you have is city-states, powerful cities that controlled territory all around them that we would call city-states. Now, think back to the last time you heard of a culture that heavily used city-states as their form of government. Yep, the ancient Greeks. So even from the get-go here, the political structure of Italy resembled what the ancient Greeks had with Athens and Sparta and constantly going to war. Here's the thesis of how the politics relates to what we'll study later, which is the art and culture. The city-states of Italy became very wealthy in the previous couple of centuries. From about 1100 to about 1300, there was an economic revival based on trade and all kinds of new things going back and forth between the East and the West. And that this economic revival fueled the cultural revival of later centuries. The three main port cities are Venice, Genoa, and Milan. Milan's not quite a port, but Venice and Genoa are. Milan was more of just a crossroads of trade. All of these cities heavily involved in trade between the Middle East and Europe. Particularly Venice and Genoa. Milan is the crossroads, actually going from south to north and east to west. These guys are in great position to make money, to have marketplaces. The Venetians and the Genoese had bigger and better and faster ships. They could trade year-round, and so they accumulated great wealth. And then all of that wealth is going to be turned around and used to support art and culture in later centuries. All of this starts really, though, in the city of Florence. So of all the three cities I just mentioned, there's one that's even more important, and that's Florence. Find it on the map here, right in the heart of the Italian peninsula, the Republic of Florence. All these little kingdoms are there, but Florence is the most important. And here's the famous view of the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, which dates back to the Renaissance here in the center of Florence. Florence was rich. It was right in the center of Tuscany. Again, it's also a crossroads of trade, and it's the wool trade, W-O-O-L, the cloth and the wool trade that makes the people of Florence so much money. They possessed enormous wealth in this city, so much so because they acquired there were lots of banks in Florence, a lot of families that operated international banks, and they had branches of these banks all over Europe. The famous Medici family, which we'll learn all about in a minute, operated the most important bank in Europe for a generation. And it's an international city. Florence is kind of like New York. You know, everybody that wants a piece of the action in economics goes to Florence in the 14th, 15th century. And they acquired control of the Pope's bank account, papal banking. And they became sort of like the tax collectors for the Pope. So when you control the bank account of the richest entity in Europe, you're going to make a lot of money. And so Florence, through the wool trade and banking, acquired tremendous wealth. There's also lots of craftsmen and guilds in Florence, lots of leather workers, lots of jewelers. It's just an incredible place. It would have been an incredible place to live at that time. The city was also very resilient. The word resilient means they survived a lot of hardship. And here's a couple of examples of how the city was just remarkable. At one point, the King of England, whose name at the time was Edward III, not important, had declared bankruptcy and said he wouldn't pay back any of his debts that he owed to all of these Florentine banks that had loaned him money. And that didn't cause a huge problem. There was so much money left that didn't cause the Florentine banks to go away. Then the Black Plague came in 1347 and killed half the city of Florence. They still rallied and survived and were strong after that. There were a series of labor revolts that we talked about going back to the end of chapter 12 of workers that were bitter and lack of opportunity. So they survived political unrest, hardship, financially and disease, and the city came out just absolutely strong. The next section gets us back to the kind of the political layout of the Italian peninsula here. And so again, all these city-states, there's no unified nation, but in these cities, there's some key groups that are players in the game here. And so we already talked about guilds. So in most of the cities of the Italian city-states, you have powerful guilds that a lot of times would acquire political power, and they would start to form sort of an oligarchy. That's a good word to know, oligarchy. That means rule by a few. And so a few rich businessmen that were part of guilds would start to make political decisions for the city. Powerful families are another key group in the cities of Italy. People like the Medici, who we'll learn about, the Sforzas in Milan. The popes came from powerful families down in the Papal States. So these guys sometimes would rule from behind the scenes rather than be actual political leaders. But think of like Jim Click maybe in Tucson, a powerful family that has a lot of influence, but they're not actually politicians. Church officials are huge, particularly in the Papal States. And in every town in Italy, the Catholic Church had a lot of officials on the ground collecting taxes, running church services, and everyone's life revolved around the church. Now, the popolo, that term means everybody else, the common people, workers, people that were unhappy that they had no say in the governments of their city-states. They were this sort of the disenfranchised of the society. And then you have what are called condottieri. These are hired soldiers, mercenaries, that whoever was ruling these cities would often hire to protect their city-state. Because look at how many city-states there are, and you couldn't have a big enough army from your own little group. So they were like soldiers for hire that would come on the scene and work for a family or a guild or even the church, and they would hire themselves out and be the security force for your particular city-state. And they'd go to war for you if you paid them enough. The Swiss often would hire out soldiers to be condottieri across Italy. And sometimes the condottieri would realize that they could just take over the government of a city-state and become the little dictator, and that happened in Milan. At one point, prior to the Renaissance, the popolo, there were these massive rebellions among the people of the city-states, and they created republics. Republic means representative government, where there were councils, and in theory there was elections and people would represent you, but these were weak, and the popolos, republics, really couldn't maintain civil order. They didn't have the proper police forces. It was sort of an experiment with some form of limited democracy, and it was sort of failed quickly. So the result of that is by 1300, what you have are called signori, signori, or oligarchies, oligarchies. Now, signori means rule by one, like a little hereditary rulership that gets passed from father to son. It's not really kings, but it's one guy rules and it follows and goes down to his son and his son. That's like sort of like the Medicis in Florence. And then you have oligarchy, which is ruled by a small group, maybe businessmen or merchants or a guild. Those are the two dominant forms of government in Renaissance Italy. What happened to the Republican governments? They were technically still around, but in name only. And so you have what's called a facade, F-A-C-A-D-E. It's sort of like a front, a fake, a false republic. They said they were still republics, but in reality, most of these city-states were run by either families or merchants. And this is an example. This is in Florence. This is the Piazza della Signoria. And that big palace you see on the left with the tower is where the signori, the little dictator, little one-man show, he would set up his office there, and he was the political leader of the city. So signori and oligarchies, but yet they maintained this illusion that there were actual republics. Now, what you want to do if you become part of the oligarchy or the signori is you establish a court, a princely court, which is another word for a large household, and you want to build yourself a palace. And this becomes the center of your power and your political place in the city. And you use your physical location, your court, to display your wealth and your power. And you want to hire the best artists to come and work for you and make you look good. And you have festivals and ceremonies and fireworks and pageants. and you put on sort of a good public show, everyone knows where you are and who you are, and it helps maintain your little rulership of the city-state. This is the Piazza della Signoria today as it looks in Florence. It's a beautiful square, one of the greatest squares in Europe, and it's filled with art, but it looks just like it did in the 15th century. And here's an example of a princely court. So these Medicis from Florence, this is their home. It was the biggest palace in the city. It was built in Renaissance style with a very rustic look of stone on the outside, but it's huge. And on the inside of it is this incredible architecture that symbolizes the rebirth of Greece and Rome. Look at these columns, look at these arches, open spaces, symmetry. This is all stuff like from the ancient world. It doesn't look like medieval Europe, but this was their princely court, and it attracted a lot of attention. All right, balance of power among the Italian city-states. Again, each of these city-states claimed they were a republic, but in reality, everyone was ruled by an oligarchy or a signori. So here we go. Venice, they are ruled by merchants, wealthy merchants that had derived their wealth from trade and from shipping, because Venice is a port city, a beautiful city in Europe, built with canals, incredible access to the sea. Venice is beautiful, and you really should visit it someday if you haven't ever been there. Here's what it looks like from the air. It's an island, actually a series of islands with canals running between them that were built out there hundreds of years before this to protect them from invaders. And it became slowly this just incredible city. It's one of the biggest tourist destinations in Europe today, and it's slowly sinking little by little every year. So it's really sad. The second major city-state of Italy is Milan, and it's run by the Sforza family, Sforza, and they were little condottieri guys that were hired by the previous people that ran Milan, and then they overthrew them, and then the Sforzas became the new political leaders of Milan, even though they were basically military leaders. Milan is famous for trade and fashion, and just today being a really cosmopolitan city. And then Florence, back to Florence, ruled by the Medici banking family, starting off with Cosimo de' Medici, who was the founder of the dynasty, the founder of the bank itself. And he was very wise, very cautious, very quiet, very much like a reserved person. But then his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, really brings the Medicis into their fullness as leaders. He's much more outspoken. He's very popular. He was very young. He would sponsor lectures on ancient Greece in their house that I just showed you. He was very much wanting to be seen as sort of like a socialite young guy. Already came from wealth, was already famous when he was born, and he brings the Medici dynasty into their peak, particularly in the sponsoring of art, which we'll get to later in this unit. Then here's some pictures of Lorenzo. All right, the Papal States, location, central Italy, right around the city of Rome. And who rules it? Well, the popes rule it, but the popes all come from powerful Roman families, and they vie for power, and sometimes they assassinate other popes, and families plot, and there's intrigue among each other. It's not the most holy way of choosing the leader of the Christian church, but that's the way it went. The most famous Renaissance pope was Alexander VI, whose real name was Borgia. That's his last name. And he becomes one of the most infamous leaders in Renaissance Italy. He was pretty wicked. He had mistresses and grandchildren, and he went to war, and he conquered ruthlessly. And he and his son, whose name was Cesare Borgia, these two become sort of a father-son duo that attracts a lot of attention. And people like Machiavelli, the political author, is going to really admire these guys for cleaning house and establishing really powerful rule in Central Europe. But they also are very, very famous and scandalous, and there's a television program on Showtime, the network, that chronicles the lives of the Borgias, and they're pretty ruthless people. And then there's Naples down in the south, and it's ruled by foreigners. So different foreign kingdoms like Spanish kings and French kings will all take a turn running Naples. So these city-states of Italy are like a jungle where the strong rule the weak. Let me go back to the map. It is messy. Everyone is loyal to their individual city-state. They don't really work that well together at first. They're spies and informants, and it's kind of a mess until about 1450. Then there's this peace treaty, which you don't need to know the name, but it's in about 1450, where they come up with a system of balance of power. And these city-states agree that we will actually prevent any one of us from becoming too powerful. We'll all maintain a roughly similar size and strength and military, and we'll shift alliances back and forth if need be. If someone gets too powerful, we'll gang up on them and push them back so that no one dominates the peninsula. This was their idea of balance of power. In order to accomplish that, they put resident ambassadors. Every city-state sent an ambassador to the other ones, and they would go live there and represent Florence, but they would live in Venice, and they would be the diplomats for the city-states. And this helped keep the peace. Very modern invention. We send diplomats all over the world. We have a Secretary of State. This worked for about 50 years until about 1494 to keep all these city-states at peace. The whole thing breaks down in 1494 when the balance of power was thrown off, when Milan invited France to come help them in a war they were about to get started against Florence and Naples. So Milan, up in the north, felt like they needed some help to teach Florence and Naples a lesson, and they invited France to help them, the King of France, 1494. And this is going to throw off the balance of power, because once a large country like France shows up and they see how weak the Italian states were, they pretty much didn't want to leave. And they thought we could just take this over for ourselves. So the French and Milan together come in and start invading down the Italian peninsula. When they get to Florence, they kicked out the Medici, actually. And the French were going to install someone else that was loyal to them. Balance of power is breaking down. And in the absence of the Medici, this other guy takes control. He's a priest named Savonarola, and he was a reformer priest. He had looked around, and he was one of these guys that wanted to change the church and make it more holy and less pagan and less worldly, and really go back to the true meaning of Christianity. He also was not a big fan of the Renaissance, which he thought was way too secular and worldly and too much emphasis on wealth and art and materialism. And he became the leader of Florence. Once the Medici were out with this French invasion, Savonarola has a little coup and takes over the government of Florence for just 4 years. He had these incredible scenes where he would burn things. He would call them bonfires of the vanities, and he'd call all the people of Florence together to burn pagan and secular books and burn jewelry or makeup or art, anything that was not really holy. And he was trying to purge all these wicked ways from the city of Florence. Again, this is all while the Medici are gone. So Savonarola lasts for about 4 years. He starts attacking everybody. He mocks the Pope. He calls for an end to the Pope. It's Pope Alexander, the evil Borgia Pope. So that guy didn't care much for Savonarola, publicly criticizing him. So he sent troops down to Florence, up to Florence, to capture and put Savonarola on trial, which he did, and the outcome was not good for Savonarola. He was burned at the stake, just like so many others, for heresy and speaking out against the truth of the Catholic Church. And here's Savonarola being burned on Piazza della Signoria right in Florence. And Savonarola's life kind of proves that a lot of people in Florence didn't really experience the Renaissance, didn't really care about it, and weren't included in it because they were so willing to fight against it. So it's one of these things people use when they're arguing about was there a Renaissance and how many people did it affect and all that. Here's the spot where Savonarola was killed. You can go visit this little spot in the center of the piazza. There's a little memorial to him. So what happens next? Italy becomes a battleground for foreign armies for the next 60, 70 years. Everyone shows up to try to take a piece of it. The Germans are there. The French are there. Italy is this massive battleground, and the main wars are called the Habsburg-Valois Wars. The Habsburgs represent the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Valois are the French. And these are big dynastic wars that carry on for decades. As part of these massive wars, because the Italian city-states are so weak and vulnerable, the Holy Roman Emperor, who's a Habsburg, whose name was Charles V, we're going to learn a lot about him later, comes down and destroys the city of Rome in 1527 and burns it to the ground, and many people think that this is kind of like the end of the Renaissance because they just simply could not coordinate their defense against these giant, massive foreign armies. So ultimately, there's warfare that's going to mark Italian history for the next few hundred years, off and on, and there is not going to be a united nation of Italy until 1870. So here we are in the 1500s. We got 350 more years before the nation of Italy will appear on the map. But in the meantime, the art, the culture that's going to come out of here is going to be spectacular.